My name is Raymond Lauda. I'm a spokesperson for Revolution Books, and I want to welcome all of you here for this very special program. I see a lot of new faces here. First time at Revolution Books, and we're happy to see you. And if you are outraged by the horrors and injustices of this world, the concentration camps being built on the border, the fact that women's right to abortion is being stripped away and their control over their bodies and their lives is subject to the control of the state. The fact that the U.S. is threatening war again against Iran. These are the horrors that we're confronting. And if you're outraged by this, then you're in the right place. If you want to see a world in which human beings can truly flourish and we can protect the environment, then you're in the right place. Because Revolution Books is the political, intellectual, and cultural center of a movement for an actual revolution. And the revolution we're talking about is a revolution to change everything, to emancipate humanity and to protect the planet. And that revolution, this revolution, is based on the new communism developed by Bob Avakian, and the beating heart of this bookstore is the new communism developed by Bob Avakian, which is a breakthrough in human understanding, a thoroughly and consistently scientific approach to understanding and changing the world. And again, if you want a different world, if you are serious about changing the world, you're in the right place. And Revolution Books is marked and characterized and pulses with critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the struggle for the truth. And again, this is wrapped up and flows from the revolution that we're about and this thoroughly scientific approach to knowing and changing the world. And I'd like to ask everyone to read the letter that you received here. There's a letter that everyone received. It's from me, the host of tonight's program, calling on you to learn more about the mission of Revolution Books, to get involved in the life of this bookstore, and to contribute to it, to donate to it, because we are nonprofit, all volunteer. And as the title of the letter says, there's no other place like Revolution Books, and there's no Revolution Books without your involvement and support. So that's an introduction to the store, and you can hang out after the program and look at the books and talk with the staff, and we're going to give you plenty of opportunity to hear from and talk with our featured speaker tonight, whom we're very excited to introduce to you, and that's David Wallace-Wells. He's going to be presenting his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. David is a deputy editor at New York Magazine. He's also a national fellow at the New American Foundation, and you had been an editor, deputy editor, associate editor at the Paris Review as well, right?
Yeah, I was there for a few years, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So David is, as you know from the book, those of you who have read it, very widely read, and someone who, and I think this is something about the book that really jumps out, who is responding to an urgent reality. As he says, climate change and the existential challenge of confronting it and acting to solve it within the next few decades. That's how serious this is. And he is sounding the alarm. And he came under quite a bit of criticism for being that way when he published the articles in New York Magazine in 2017 documenting the different dimensions of this crisis. And then shortly later, the 2018 report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its report and painted a very dire picture of the state of things. And this was vindicating the alarm that he was sounding. And I know David is, in the book, talks about, well, it's okay to freak out, but that doesn't mean we surrender. Right? Doesn't mean that we surrender and resign ourselves to this. No, we have to confront it in all its urgency and globality. It is a planetary question. So David is going to make a presentation that we're all looking forward to. Then I'm going to have a brief conversation with him on the stage. Then we're going to open it up to you. And we like here at Revolution Books to give the audience plenty of opportunity to interact with the authors who come to speak here. And after that, we'll enable you to get the book and have it signed by David. And again, hang out and let's talk. And without any further introduction, I want to bring David to the stage, and let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. It's so great to see you all here. I'm excited. I'm less excited about my presentation, more excited about the Q&A at the end, and especially to talk about, some of the political implications of the climate crisis. I think we don't yet know what that future is going to look like, but I think we know enough to know that it will probably scramble just about everything about the contemporary politics that many of us take for granted. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think the best way to start is for me to do a little reading that gives the really big picture for how I see this story. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to it, which is interesting and kind of telling as a case study and someone waking up from complacency into engagement on its own. I'm going to just read from the very beginning of the book, since I think that's sort of the best introduction. It is worse, much worse than you think. The slowness of climate change is a fairy tale, perhaps as pernicious as the one that says it isn't happening at all, and comes to us bundled with several others in an anthology of comforting delusions. That global warming is an Arctic saga, unfolding remotely. That it is strictly a matter of sea level and coastlines, not an enveloping crisis sparing no place and leaving no life undeformed. That it is a crisis of the natural world, not the human one. That those two are distinct, and that we live today somehow outside or beyond, or at the very least defended against nature, not inescapably within and literally overwhelmed by it. That wealth can be a shield against the ravages of warming, that the burning of fossil fuels is the price of continued economic growth, that growth and the technology it produces will allow us to engineer our way out of environmental disaster, that there is any analog to the scale or scope of this threat in the long span of human history that might give us confidence in staring it down. None of this is true. But let's begin with the speed of change. The Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions before the one we are living through now, each so complete a wiping of the fossil record that it functioned as an evolutionary reset. The planet's phylogenetic tree first expanding and then collapsing at intervals like a lung. 86% of all species dead 450 million years ago. 70 million years later, 75%. 125 million years later, 96%. 50 million years later, 80%. 135 million years after that, 75% again. Unless you are a teenager, you probably read in your high school textbooks that these extinctions were the result of asteroids. In fact, all but the one that killed the dinosaurs involved climate change produced by greenhouse gas. The most notorious was 250 million years ago. It began when carbon dioxide warmed the planet by 5 degrees Celsius, accelerated when that warming triggered the release of methane, another greenhouse gas, and ended with all but a sliver of life on Earth dead. We are currently adding carbon to the atmosphere at a considerably faster rate. By most estimates, at least 10 times faster. The rate is 100 times faster than at any point in human history before the beginning of industrialization. And there is already, right now, fully a third more carbon in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, perhaps in as long as 15 million years. There were no humans then. The oceans were more than 100 feet higher. Many perceive global warming as a sort of moral and economic debt accumulated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and now come due after several centuries. In fact, more than half of the carbon exhaled into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels has been emitted in just the last 3 decades, which means we have done as much damage to the fate of the planet and its ability to sustain human life and civilization since Al Gore published his first book on climate than in all the centuries, all the millennia that came before. The United Nations established its climate change framework in 1992, advertising scientific consensus unmistakably to the world. This means we have now engineered as much ruin knowingly as we ever managed in ignorance. Global warming may seem like a distended morality tale playing out over several centuries and inflicting a kind of Old Testament retribution on the great-great-grandchildren of those responsible, since it was carbon burning in 18th century England that lit the fuse of everything that followed. But that is a fable about historical villainy that acquits those of us alive today, and unfairly. The majority of the burning has come since the premiere of Seinfeld. Since the end of World War II, the figure is about 85%. The story of the industrial world's kamikaze mission is the story of a single lifetime. The planet brought from seeming stability to the brink of catastrophe in the years between a baptism or bar mitzvah and a funeral. We all know those lifetimes. When my father was born in 1938, the climate system appeared to most human observers steady. Scientists had understood the greenhouse effect, had understood the way that carbon produced by burned wood and coal and oil could hothouse the planet and disequilibrate everything on it for 3/4 of a century. But they had not yet seen the impact. Not really, not yet. Which made warming seem less like an observed fact than a dark prophecy, to be fulfilled only in a very distant future. Perhaps never. By the time my father died in 2016, weeks after the desperate signing of the Paris Agreement, the climate system was tipping towards devastation, passing a threshold of carbon concentration 400 parts per million, in the early banal language of climatology, that had been for years the bright red line environmental scientists had drawn in the rampaging face of modern industry, saying, "Do not cross." Of course, we kept going. Just 2 years later, we hit a monthly average of 411, and guilt saturates the planet's air as much as carbon, though we choose to believe we do not breathe it. Just point out, actually this year we hit 415. This book was published in February. It's already like hopelessly out of date. The single lifetime is also the lifetime of my mother, born in 1945, to German Jews fleeing the smokestacks through which their relatives were incinerated, and now enjoying her 73rd year in an American commodity paradise, a paradise supported by the factories of a developing world that has, in the space of a single lifetime too, manufactured its way into the global middle class with all the consumer enticements and fossil fuel privileges that come with that ascent: electricity, private cars, air travel, red meat. She has been smoking for 58 of those years unfiltered, ordering the cigarettes now by the carton from China. She's here tonight.
Not ordering anything from China.
It is also the lifetime of many of the scientists who first raised public alarm about climate change, some of whom incredibly remain working. That is how rapidly we have arrived at this promontory. In the 1970s, much of the pioneering research on climate change was done with funding from Exxon, a company now the target of a raft of lawsuits that aim to adjudicate responsibility for the rolling emissions regime that today, barring a change of course on fossil fuels, threatens to make parts of the planet more or less unlivable for humans by the end of this century. That is the course we are speeding so blithely along, to more than 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100. According to some estimates, that would mean that whole regions of Africa and Australia and the United States, parts of South America north of Patagonia, and Asia south of Siberia would be rendered uninhabitable by direct heat, desertification, and flooding. Certainly, it would make them inhospitable, and many more regions besides. This is our itinerary, our baseline, which means that if the planet was brought to the brink of climate catastrophe within the lifetime of a single generation, the responsibility to avoid it belongs with a single generation too. We all also know that second lifetime. It is ours. Which I guess is a way of me saying it is mine. And I think it's, having set the stage in that way, worth talking a little bit about how I came to the subject, because it makes me uncomfortable even being up here talking about it. It makes me uncomfortable being in a bookstore, as distinguished as this, as committed politically as this is, because I spent most of my life quite complacent politically. It makes me uncomfortable being up here talking about climate change, because I spent most of my life, if not in total ignorance about climate change, then something close to it. I still don't today consider myself an environmentalist. I don't think of myself as a nature person. I've never been on a hike. I've never owned a pet. I've lived my whole life in New York City, and I felt, walking these concrete streets, looking up at these, steel buildings, that I was living somehow outside of nature, and that modern life was a fortress that would protect me from even the forces of climate change that I understood were coming for some parts of the world at some date. I think many people in the modern world have those same sets of delusions, that climate change may be scary, but we are defended against its impacts by the accoutrements of the world that we know. And the more time I spent really knee-deep in this research, I spent a couple of years getting deeper and deeper into it, the more I really understood that this was, an unbelievable, overwhelming, total delusion. And I came to think that delusion had 3 parts. The first is the speed of change, which I talk a little bit about in the excerpt that I just read. You can almost choose any benchmark, any date at all over the last 50 years, and you'll be astonished by just how much damage has been done since that time. I was recently giving a talk in front of some tech people, and since the iPhone was released, a quarter of all the emissions that we've produced in the entire history of humanity have been produced just since 2007. We're now eating up something like 15 million extra barrels of oil every single day than we were in 2004, I think I saw today. Those figures may not be exactly right, but we are not, as most people may assume watching the news, simply not moving fast enough to take action on climate. We're still very much moving in the wrong direction. Every year is worse than the year before when it comes to emissions. Last year, the US emissions grew, in part, it's been documented, because of the extra demand for energy that came from the extra use of air conditioners to deal with extreme heat. So we're already getting into these kind of dangerous feedback loops where our own behavior, but also the behavior of natural systems in the world, could theoretically accelerate warming somewhat dramatically. And this is happening at just 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming, which makes the planet already today hotter than it's ever been in all of human history. That means that you and I and everyone in this room is walking on Earth that's hotter than any Earth that's ever been walked on by humans before. And it means that everything that we know of as human history, which includes the deep history of the evolution of the human animal, means the invention of agriculture, the development of rudimentary civilization through agriculture, the development of modern civilization, everything we know about the human as a biological creature, as a social creature, as a political creature, all of those were developed under climate conditions that no longer prevail. So it's as though we've landed on an entirely new planet with a totally different set of climate conditions, and we have to figure out what of the civilization that we've smuggled with us here can survive, and what changes we have to make to that civilization to allow us to survive in this new world, which is continuing to warm probably even more dramatically than it's warmed in the past. We see that speed of change in the extreme weather, heat waves. I mean, there have been 2 historic heat waves in Europe in the last month. These were heat waves that a century ago would have been considered not just generational, but unheard of. And we've had 2 of them in a month. Similar thing a few months ago in the storms that hit Mozambique. We saw a typhoon that was the hardest typhoon to hit Mozambique in 50 years. 5 weeks later, another one arrived. Houston has been hit by 3 500-year storms in the last 3 years. 500-year storms is a thing you hear about from meteorologists on TV. It's a term that's, you may hear so much it's sort of lost its meaning, but it originally meant a storm that you expected to hit once every 500 years. That would mean one storm that hit in the entire history of the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, the conquest of the American West, and the genocide of Native Americans here, the building of a slave economy, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the ending of that slave economy, the modernization, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, September 11th, the financial crisis. This is a history that should have contained one of these storms, and Houston has been hit by 3 of them in the last 3 years. We are already living in a completely unprecedented climate environment, and because of that, we're seeing the impacts arriving faster and faster every day. So that's the first big delusion, which is the speed of change. The second thing is about, for me anyways, was about the scope. I learned about this in high school. I read about it in newspapers. I watched Inconvenient Truth. I really thought that the main threat from climate change was sea level rise, arising from the melting of Arctic ice. And that is scary. I mean, if we lose all the Arctic ice sheets and Antarctic ice sheets, which scientists believe would happen at about 2.1 degrees of warming, which for my money is about the best case scenario we could possibly hope for. If we lose them, we'll probably get about 250 or 260 feet of sea level rise. But that'll happen over many centuries, and a lot of these impacts are happening much more quickly, and they are literally everywhere. When you learn about the economic impacts, which could cut global GDP by 30% by the end of the century, which is an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression and would be permanent, to the impact on conflict, which could double by the end of the century if we don't change course on climate, because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict, to the impact on agriculture, which could be half as bountiful globally by the end of the century, and we'd probably be using that 50% grain yield to feed 50% more people, to the impacts on public health, where mosquitoes that had been carrying malaria and dengue just around the tropics will now be flying into the Arctic Circle, to just the impact of direct heat, which is at just 2 degrees, which we're scheduled to get to at about 2035 or 2040 if we don't change course. Many of the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East will be unlivably hot. It means that you won't be able to go outside during summer. You certainly wouldn't be able to work outside during summer without risking heat stroke and possibly death. These are cities that contain today 10, 12, 15 million people. And that's one reason why the UN estimates that just by 2050, we'll have at least, they say, 200 million climate refugees. They say it's possible we could have 1 billion climate refugees, which is as many people as today live in North and South America combined, 1 billion. I think those numbers are a bit high. I think probably these societies are going to be considerably more resilient. But even if you take the low-end estimate, 200 million, divided in half, It's 100 times the size of the Syrian refugee crisis that so completely changed European politics and really triggered the populist wave, the populist backlash of global politics that we're still living through today. When you see all of these together, this is not a matter of a threat that we can compartmentalize or escape. We can't just think, well, if we don't live on the coast, we'll be safe. This will impact every life on this planet in some way. Some people will be hit more than others. Already the global south is being hit much more intensely than people living in a place like New York City. And that pattern will continue, but there will be no place where you can truly escape it. It's genuinely an all-encompassing, all-touching threat. And it made me really realize how foolish it was to think that this could be compartmentalized at all. So that was my second big delusion. And the third was about the severity. Up until a couple years ago, the worst thing you'd read about in the newspapers was a global warming of about 2 degrees Celsius. Scientists called it catastrophic warming. The island nations of the world call it genocide. Mm-hmm. And you would hear from scientists whenever these studies were being talked about, they would say, we have to do everything we can to avoid 2 degrees. We have to do everything we can. The UN now says that in order to avoid 2 degrees of warming safely, we would need to have our global emissions by 2030, which would require a global World War II scale mobilization against climate starting this year, 2019. But I think you could read those stories about 2 degrees, they're still being written, and think that that was therefore kind of a worst case scenario. But in fact, practically speaking, it's our best case. And all of the scenarios that are north of that, 3 degrees, 3.5, 4 degrees, 4.5, and into the next century, up all the way to 8, 10, 12, 13 degrees warming, were basically not talked about at all. And those are where the truly terrifying impacts begin. Whole nations literally inhospitable to human life, the whole equatorial region of the planet being unlivable, the population, which would still number in the billions, rushing northward, rushing southward away from the heat, but also the impacts on the agriculture that I talked about, and the way that puts pressure on nation states and social order, likely to produce enormous disarray. Now, there are a lot of people on the environmental left who think that climate change is likely to produce a real collapse of civilization. I'm not one of those people, certainly not this century, but if we do get to, say, 8 or 10 or 12 degrees of warming next century, I think it's really hard to imagine anything like the world that we know today surviving. And that means that, we really need to change course right now, because if we've done all of this damage, brought the planet from a stable situation to the brink of catastrophe in just 30 years, scientists now say we have about that much time to really change course and avert some of these impacts. And I look at that, I'm 36 years old, so my life contains the entire story of, dramatic climate impacts. All of the damage that we've done, all of the work that we've done to produce these terrifying possibilities has been done in my lifetime. But I also think I probably have at least 30 years to live, which means that I also will be living through whatever response we're able to muster. And, I happen to look at that I can be terrified, I can get depressed like anybody. I also compartmentalize and forget about it for a little bit sometimes. But I also try to think of it in exhilarating terms. Because when I talk about how awful climate change could get, those droughts, those famines, those hurricanes, the agricultural problems, the public health problems, the war, economic collapse, those can be terrifying, they seem so large, but ultimately they're a reflection of how much power we have over the climate. Because if we get to that point, it will be because of what we do from here on out. None of that is written in stone. None of it will happen if we change course immediately and dramatically. And the best part is we have our hands on those levers today. Climate is changing because of the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. Very simple. Collectively, if we could marshal the political will and focus, we could stop putting carbon into the atmosphere very quickly. We have most of the tools we need to do that today. Probably could use some tech R&D and stuff, but we can basically follow the path that we need to follow to avoid catastrophic warming. The question is just whether we will. And I think that's very much an open question. I'm not all that confident, but it is comforting, I think, to know that the only obstacles that stand in our way are human ones. It's the culture that we've built, it's the politics we've built, it's the economy that we've built. And if we can really transform those human systems, there's no reason at all, no scientific reason, no technological reason, that we can avoid almost all of these impacts that I've talked about. But I also think it's really important to keep in mind as we push forward and try to secure a livable, prosperous, fulfilling future for our children and grandchildren and their children and grandchildren, that this whole story is not binary. It's not a matter of winning the fight against climate change or losing it. It's not a matter of avoiding 2 degrees or crossing it. Every tick upward of temperature that we'll produce more suffering. And every tick upward that we can avoid will reduce suffering. So even if we get to 4 or 5 degrees and the world is totally hellish and burned over and miserable, it'll still be in our power to write the story of the future climate of the planet, to determine what temperatures will be a decade down that line or 2 decades down that line, and to determine just how much human suffering there will be from that point forward. So this is not, you hear a lot about this, like we have 12 years to avert really catastrophic climate change, which is, I think, an honest reading of what the UN says. But it's not the case that if we pass into a catastrophic situation, we should then give up. The fight is going to be eternal. It's going to define my life. It will, no matter what you think, it's going to define probably all of your lives, because the world will be that dramatically transformed by it. And in the book, I write at some length, not just about the scientific impacts, but what I think of as the kind of humanities of climate change, which is to say, this is not just a matter of coral reefs dying or corn becoming less bountiful, et cetera, et cetera. It's a matter of what will our politics look like in a world that's defined by considerably more resource scarcity? What will our culture look like? How will we think of our place in history, understand our relationship to nature? What will we think of technology if we see technology as having brought us to this point? What will we think of technology if we see technology as our only path forward? Because innovation, in a variety of ways, may be our sort of deus ex machina. And I think these are quite profound questions, which are likely to be actually as profound as the ones that the climate itself is asking of us. That is, the impacts are going to change, the cultural impacts are going to change the way that we live as much, I think, as the direct climate impacts are. And I think we've only just begun to sort of think about what that world will look like and how we will find ways to live in it. My book is a sort of effort to preliminarily sketch out a few of those areas of inquiry. But I think it's up to all of us to really try to process some of these questions and to try to build a new politics, a new culture, a new relationship to capitalism, to technology that might allow us to really reorient the course of the world and avoid unimaginable, indeed, like genuinely existential suffering, which is, make no mistake, where we're headed if we choose not to act. So I think, maybe we could, you want to talk now?
Yeah,
come up here?
sure.
Some questions? Thank you.
Great. Let's give David another round of applause.
Yeah.
This was, how many people have read the book? If you could raise your hands. Don't be ashamed if you haven't, because you're gonna buy it tonight and get it signed, and you're gonna read it because you've heard David speak. Okay. Look, this is, he's written a timely and important book. And, I think I heard the deep breaths in the room, as you were presenting your findings and, your kind of state of the planet report. This is very sobering. This is very serious. This is very dire. This is monumental. Adjectives like unprecedented, which, make their way through your book are entirely apt and just. And this is a wake-up call. And it's important that we're here to get into this discussion. And I'm going to, pose a few questions, make a
Please.
few comments, and then we're going to open it to you, the audience. I just first wanted to start because I see that, the majority of the people are new to the work and are hearing this presentation for the first time. One, I just want to start here. You talk about some of the problems of looking at this from the perspective of a new normal, and that there are ways in which this gets processed, through, you talk about culture, you talk about, the ways in which, the society and the system tries to acclimate people to, this climate disaster. But maybe you could say something about, the problem with this terminology of, well, we've got a climate crisis now, and that's the new normal we're going to be functioning within. And I thought there's some very interesting insights you have into what's wrong with that.
I mean, the short answer of what's wrong with it is that it's not a stable situation. That, in the book I say the better phrase would be the end of normal. And we are now, as I mentioned, a couple minutes ago, we're now entirely outside the window of temperatures that have enclosed and indeed defined all of human history. But we're not in a new situation where things are stable. Every year is getting warmer, and will probably continue to get warmer, actually for decades, if not at least a century, even if we immediately stop emitting carbon today, because there are a lot of natural processes that take a long time to play out that affect the actual temperature of the planet. And so for all of our lifetimes, the world will be getting warmer basically every year than the previous year was. And that means that we will never be able to genuinely recalibrate our expectations if we are recalibrating them based on whatever the present tense of climate change is. And I think that's there's a kind of a human cognitive problem that raises, in the sense that, even someone like me who reads and writes about climate change almost daily, I still experience the present tense of climate much more frequently than I experience any projection for future warming.
Right.
And that means that my emotional expectation is anchored by today, not even by what I know will happen going forward. And I think problematically, that means that, it's one reason why we tend to sort of reflexively discount a lot of predictions that are made about the future, because we are reminded every day of this baseline rather than orienting our own expectations about, I think, is a much better baseline, where we're headed. So,
Right.
I get asked a lot, is there any cause for hope or cause for optimism? And I always say, it's really a matter of perspective, in the sense that if you're expecting or hoping that the planet can be stabilized exactly as it is today, or ideally like it was 75 years ago, there's no hope for that. That is definitely not going to happen. But if you're basing your expectations on 4.3 degrees Celsius, which is what the UN says we're on track for by the end of the century, I think there's considerable cause for optimism and hope that we'll be able to bend that curve, avoid some probably significant amount of that warming, but probably not avoid what we would think of today as some truly catastrophic impacts. And, that then leads me to think about really the perspective that we carry into all of our projections of the future, and how quickly we tend to process what would have once struck us as completely horrifying outcomes as though they are already baked into the present tense. And I did some reporting earlier this year in California, really looking at this question, particularly as it related to wildfire, and was horrified. I mean, these are, I talked to the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, and he's 48 years old. The year he was born, 60,000 acres burned in California. The year he was elected mayor, 2013, it was 600,000, so a tenfold increase. The year he was re-elected 4 years later, 2017, 4 years later, it was 1.2 million, so a doubling in 4 years. And last year was 1.9 million, so another 50% increase in just 4 years. And he said to me that, amazingly, he said, there's nothing we can do. There's no amount of firefighters we can hire, no amount of fire engines we could buy, no amount of brush we can clear that can stop this. The only thing that will stop this is when the weather, probably long after we're gone, relaxes into a more normal state. But when I spoke to people, I spoke to a woman in Malibu who lived through 9 fires. And she was only considering moving now because she had just gotten divorced and needed to buy a new place. And I said, as I'm a New Yorker, I just literally don't understand how, if you're living in a neighborhood that is, since you've been living there, been burned over 9 times, and last year's fire was twice as bad as the worst fire ever before in the history of LA County, how you could possibly think that this is a habitable place for you. But everybody there said to me some version of, well, we've always had fires. Right. And I would say, no, but really, look at the history. It's really way worse now. And scientists say it's going to get at least twice as bad, probably 4 times as bad by 2050. And there's decent science that says it could get 64 times worse by the end of the century, which would mean 3/4 of California would be burning every year. Right? There are reasons that science that's a little too alarmist, I think, but nevertheless, things are going to get considerably worse. And the thinking a little more globally about normalization, there's this paper that I write about in the book. I talk about a lot because it preoccupies me. I think about it a lot. It studied just the difference between 1.5 degrees warming and 2 degrees of warming. So just to reiterate, this is almost certainly a level of warming that we're likely to have. Mm-hmm. It's just a 0.5 degree of warming. And the authors looked at the impact that would come from that just through air pollution. So just through one area of impact. And they found that just that 0.5 degree, just through air pollution, would kill an additional 153 million people. And when I say that to audiences like you, I can see in the room people are horrified. They think this is completely unconscionable, and it is. It's death at the scale of 25 Holocausts. But 9 million people are already dying every year from air pollution. And my life isn't really oriented around those people. Most of the lives of people in the wealthy West are not oriented around those people and those deaths. So we're already engaged in a kind of collective act of normalization, compartmentalization, and denial. And I worry that moving forward, rather than really acquainting ourselves with what is possible and forcing ourselves to continue to be horrified by it, we will find ways to just normalize, recalibrate our expectations, so much so that even 50 years from now, if warming is totally out of control, my children and grandchildren may think everything's sort of okay. Right. And on some level, that could be a comfort, because the world will go on. On another level, it's an incredible horror and a moral indictment that we would be capable of such normalization. Mm. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is really focus us so clearly on the medium term and even long term, because if we're always only thinking about 1 year down the road, it's never going to seem that much worse than where we are. And it's really helpful to give some longer term projections, ideally in a kind of timeline that still feels close enough that we'll experience, to make us understand just how dramatic these impacts can be and just how urgent action is needed to avoid them.
Right. I think this is extremely important, what you're saying. And, I want to, pursue this in 2 different ways. You do make the point that we have to have the anguish, that we can't seek to sort of disabuse ourselves of anguish. We have to anguish over this, and we have to act, okay? And here I want to sort of move in the direction of what is efficacious action. And by way of introduction, I'd like you to sort of comment on something that you speak to in the book. You use the phrase, bend the curve. And we're talking about bending the curve of carbon emissions and the catastrophic levels of pollution and all of what you describe. And by the way, there's a chapter on disease and the spread of disease and the mutation of disease, as a function of climate change. That's very there's information in there that people may not be acquainted with. Again, the book is covering very wide ground, the planet. But bending the curve and efficacious actions and what will solve the problem, I want to move or enable us to confront this problem. I want to move in that direction. And you make the point that green technology, do people know what the phrase green technology means? I'm assuming yes, right? That, these are, right, the solar power and, geothermal power, right? And, the green technologies, when this was, I did a lot of writing on this, a few years back, and we have a supplement, Revolution newspaper, revcom.us, but there's a supplement, Environmental Emergency, and this was written in 2010, and at that time, there was a lot of, of sort of fascination with green technology, that this would be the way forward, and that this could be done within the framework of the, the system, that it could be incentivized, and that this would, affect rapid change in the proportion of fossil fuels to sustainable modes. But you make the point, and maybe I'll let you make the point, that this was not the outcome of the adoption of quote unquote green technologies, and that as they came on stream, I don't want to, you document that. I think it's very important because this was considered a fix, the green technology, but it didn't work out that way.
Well, I think in the long run, if we are to engineer a fix, green energy will be a big part of it.
No, that is an essential part. But
yeah, there's been incredible...
why did it not? In other words, the point, I just want to be clear, green technology is absolutely
essential.
Yeah. It's an incontrovertible point, and there's a lot of potential in that.
Well, the fossil fuel companies might controvert it, but yeah.
That's right. and that's the question of why the curve was not bent.
Yeah, so it's really remarkable, the progress that we made on renewable energy cost over the last decade and a half. Actually, globally, a lot of it has to do with the innovations that were spurred by investments as part of the stimulus package in 2009 in the U.S., which is, climate change is full of morality tales, and one of them is that the U.S. can be an important intellectual property leader on this question in a way that is immediately then available to the rest of the world in a very productive way. There are a lot of people on the right today who say the U.S. shouldn't take action because what's going to happen in China and India. I think the way that green energy that we've invested in has spread around the world is a really good indication that what we do will likely lead the way forward everywhere. But even though green energy is now cheaper than anybody would have predicted, even its biggest advocates a decade or 2 decades ago, and in much of the world, it's already cheaper than dirty energy. Probably it will be cheaper than dirty energy everywhere in the world relatively soon, say in the next decade. The ratio of clean energy to dirty energy has not grown at all, not just in the last 10 years. It hasn't grown in the last 50 years, which means that we are still proportionally in the same place we were, when we were fixing solar panels onto geodesic domes in the 60s. And that's because we responded to this new source of energy, not by retiring the dirty sources,
right,
but by supplementing them,
right,
so that we would have more capacity. And so by that logic, we're actually not just in the same place we were 50 years ago, we're in a worse place because we've added renewables, but we've also added dirty capacity. And
right,
China's still opening new coal plants.
Right.
The U.S. is still, breaking ground on natural gas projects. Canada, last month, they declared a climate emergency, this kind of unprecedented commitment, rhetorical commitment to the scale and urgency of the crisis. The next day, they approved a new oil pipeline. And this is the kind of behavior I think that, we've seen over the last decade, but I think, unfortunately, it's going to be even more apparent, I think, in the decade ahead, which is to say, world leaders making very aggressive public gestures of rhetorical commitment, but then conspiring to at least act much more slowly on climate than people like you and me might like. And that's in part because they face in the absence of a true global cooperative framework in which to orient and organize climate action, every nation faces really perverse incentives because, Australia just had an election a couple weeks ago, maybe now a month ago, where it was expected that the Liberal, who was quite, appealingly left, if not radical enough for me on climate, was very much expected to win. And in fact, he was defeated by the Conservative Prime Minister, who ran a campaign very focused on the cost of climate action. But Australia as a country is responsible for about 1% of global emissions. And that means even if they implemented the most absolutely radical plan that you could possibly imagine and totally eliminated all their emissions tomorrow, it would have practically no impact on the climate that they were experiencing 3-4 decades from now if the rest of the world didn't follow suit. And that is the perverse collective action problem that every single nation faces. And I think it's one reason why you're going to see, a lot of climate leaders like Justin Trudeau who want to pat themselves on the back for making rhetorical commitments, but also want to slow walk action within their own nations in order to sort of reap the immediate economic benefits that are available from the use of cheap energy.
All right. So I think this, I think that there's an important lesson here in the way that green technology was assimilated into into a profit-driven capitalist system, and it itself, as we see with the trade war and the tariff wars, solar panels, are not just abstract, innovations, right? But they themselves are subject to commercialization, to marketization, to protection of markets, right? And you mentioned intellectual property rights. So all of these technologies are enveloped in the nature of the economic system that we live in, and fossil fuels are foundational to the profitable functioning of this system. And one of the it's you mentioned Trudeau and others and the rhetorical gestures, and Obama is a supreme example of that, because he came in as a quote unquote sort of a green sensitive president, and yet we saw the largest rise in oil production under his watch in 50 to 70 years that took place there, and then the fracking boom obviously. And that sort of leads me, based on what you're saying, and to a comment that you made in the in the presentation, where you talk about what are the obstacles, because clearly technology is not the obstacle. You go to great lengths to demonstrate the potential, right? I mean, there's controversy, yes, over carbon capturing carbon and storing it, but that's a good question, a good discussion to have about technology. But that's not the basic question. You talk about the technological potential, but then you do wrestle with the question of what are the obstacles to this, right? And I'm sort of here at Revolution Books. What we put before people is that the obstacle is the system of capitalism, imperialism, that we live under, because it is driven by profit, and fossil fuels are profitable. And then when you do get these new technologies, what you're saying, they get filtered through, if you will, the workings of a system based on profit and expand or die. That this is, if General Motors were to say, well, we're not going to invest in China because we want to make our contribution to limiting carbon emissions, then Toyota, Volkswagen goes in and takes the market, and vice versa. They're driven by competition, to seize markets. And you talk about that in the book, that that the changed climate and the changed geography and terrain, literally, of the planet is now the seascape and the landscape on which the great power rivalry takes place. You speak about that. So what I'm posing here, and what we get into in the bookstores, is the obstacle, lack of will? Is it, is it just that people don't know what the technologies are that are available? Or is there something in the working of the system, this capitalist imperialist system, that is the fundamental problem? And that is profit, the private ownership, the competition, the fact that the time horizons, and this is something that I was thinking about in reading your book, the incredible discussion of it's fast and it's long, right? That you say that the changes occur very quickly, what's happening, and then at the same time have incredibly long-term consequences. But capitalism its horizons are short-term by definition. You have to maximize profit, right? And then you're seeking to gain market share, and then there's bankruptcy, and then there's all of that. So here I think that we have to confront the obstacle of this system, and then the question is what would replace it, and we get into how we would make a revolution and what would be a viable alternative to this, where you're not basing a society on profit, and in which your perspective is global, the planet, and not the defense of General Motors or the national market,
Right.
And these leaders, the Justin Trudeau's, however quote unquote enlightened they present themselves. I mean, we've got a fascist in power now, right? For whom coal is, listen, peons and praises to coal. What does that say about the state of civilization at this moment? So, what I would put, what I think we have to wrestle with is what is that fundamental obstacle?
Well, I would just say a couple of things. You mentioned the speed and the time horizons. I was just reading a really fascinating piece today by Paul Mason, in which he said, the left has always assumed that time was on its side, and that change may not be coming fast enough, but that over a long enough time horizon, you would assume that progress would be achieved, and that different sectors had different different levels of patience for that change to arrive. But the really complicating thing for the left when it comes to climate is that we don't have time. We can't wait for those changes to be made. And I think the obstacles that stand in our way, I think it's a really complicated, thorny system, very complicated question to answer. I am personally more focused on the political economy than I am narrowly on the economic system. I do think that, for instance, if fossil fuel interests hadn't captured nearly as much political power as they have, that we'd be in a much better place, not just in the US, but globally. And there was a report that was put out by the IMF this year, which is not, the IMF is not a left-wing organization. And
The IMF we call the Institute for Misery and Famine.
Yeah, I maybe wouldn't go that far, but anyway, it's interesting. Actually, been watching over the last few years how many of the institutions of the sort of neoliberal order have started to really ask some quite profound questions about the health of the system that they helped shepherd forward. The World Bank and the IMF have been two that have actually put out a lot of quite provocative papers over the last couple of years. But they found that in this study that globally, fossil fuel businesses were being subsidized by to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. And a lot of those aren't direct subsidies. They have to do with the fact that the price of carbon doesn't actually reflect the environmental impact and that kind of thing. But it does mean that many of these companies, it's certainly the case for coal, I think it's also the case for a lot of other fossil fuel interests, that they would not be profitable businesses if it were not for the public support of all of these governments. And that, to me, suggests really the problem in a nutshell. And just to give you a sense, that $5.3 trillion sounds like a ton of money, which it is. But there are these, you mentioned this earlier, there are these machines that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere. We already have them, they work, they're quite expensive. There's a lot of questions about how we could deploy them at scale, and how feasible it is to really use them as a total solution to the climate crisis. I don't think that they are. But in theory, if we wanted to deploy these machines globally to completely neutralize all of the carbon emissions that we're producing today, that means we could continue operating exactly as we are today and produce no additional carbon, would cost about $3 trillion a year. So we're already subsidizing the fossil fuel business more than it would cost to completely halt the problem in its tracks. And for me, that's really a matter of our political priorities. And I think it's certainly the case that we can't avoid catastrophic warming without, at the very least, a significant remodeling of the capitalistic system that we live under. But I think that the problems of political economy are more pressing and more important, and that if we're able to really reorient our politics and our policy globally, that we conceivably could avoid some of these really terrifying outcomes. And then the question is, what's stopping us as, say, voters, mobilizers, organizers? And, I think that's also a really complicated question. I mean, I myself am not 24 hours a day advocating on this. I think very few people are, because the human mind resists that kind of total panic freak out that would require. And because we're reluctant to really take seriously some of these quite scary projections, and because we have what's called, economists call status quo bias, where we tend to, as unjust as we find the world that we live in, still tend to sort of relax into a state where we expect it to continue and don't ask that it change all that much, most of us. And because at the level of the community, at the level of our politics, we have forces acting similarly against radical change. And then there's the sort of obstacle I mentioned earlier at the geopolitical level, which is that all these nations, even if they were led by people who are quite committed on climate, would probably find themselves incentivized to not take rapid action themselves in the absence of a true cooperative global framework. And that's why, that last piece is why what I think of as the failure of the Paris Accords is so scary. The Paris Accords were signed in 2016, and no major industrial nation is on track to honor the pledges it made under the Paris Accords, not a single one. The only two nations in the entire world that are working in a way that's even compatible with the goals of Paris are Morocco and Gambia. And the goals of Paris, it was designed to that we would ratchet up our commitments over time. So even those pledges that were made don't save us from catastrophic warming. They would get us to about 3.2 degrees of warming, which would mean still the total loss of all ice sheets, which would mean that 250, 260 feet of sea level rise. It would mean that Calcutta would be unlivable. It would mean that you couldn't go on pilgrimage to Mecca because it would be too hot. It would mean, catastrophic impacts agriculturally in terms of public health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Paris Accords were an international framework built on the old sort of post-Cold War model of liberal internationalism that was an attempt to organize individual nations' action towards what was thought of as an ambitious goal. It was not nearly ambitious enough, and no nation in the world is on track to honor those commitments. So I think there are barriers at every single level, obstacles at every single level. On the other hand, I do think that, when you look at the politics of climate as it's evolved over the last year, in particular since the UN's IPCC report that you mentioned last October, it's hard not to be encouraged. When I turned in the book last September, I didn't think there was much near-term hope for real political momentum on climate. And what we've seen actually in the last year is, Greta Thunberg starting her climate strikes, mobilizing millions of European school children to do the same, and pressuring the president of the EU to commit that a quarter of all money spent by the EU would be spent on climate mitigation and adaptation. We've seen Extinction Rebellion in the UK pressure a conservative parliament to declare a climate emergency and get Theresa May on her way out the door to commit to zero carbon by 2050, which is not as fast as I would like, but is so much faster than any country in the world would have ever thought was possible, even just a year ago. Denmark just declared that it was going to cut its emissions by 70% by 2030, which is incredible. And here in the US, we've had the Sunrise Movement, the election of AOC, the floating of the Green New Deal, a totally different paradigm through which even the center-left of American politics is thinking about this issue. We have a presidential campaign in which every single Democratic candidate is competing to be more serious than the next about climate change. And with the possible exception of Jay Inslee, I don't think any of them are being serious enough. And yet, it is still an incredible sea change from last election season when not a single question was asked at the presidential debates about climate change. And then the previous Democratic president, who I'm an admirer of Barack Obama's, but he came into office hoping to, to bring about a real aggressive climate plan, scrapped it in favor of healthcare reform, and basically sat on the issue for 5 years until he was able to do some small things via executive action, many of which the Trump administration has turned back. So we're talking about an entirely different environment when it comes to the politics of climate. And we're sort of used to thinking of, we hear those words about the Democratic Party in general now, that this is a very different party than Obama's party. But I think it's nowhere more true than it's true on climate. Now, I would say things are moving really fast. They are not moving nearly fast enough. And yet, it's still not, it's hard not to be at least encouraged by what's happened over the last year, which is, I think, from any political science standard, really rapid progress. It's just that from the standard of science, it's hopelessly inadequate.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I saw some hands up, and we can continue this, this dialogue, but let's bring the audience in. I think it's very important. But I do want to, just from your book, you said this on page 214. You can't halfway your way to a solution to a crisis this big. You can't halfway your way to a solution to a crisis this big. And David, I'm going to hold you to that criterion, okay? Because I'm going to leave it at that. So let's see a show of hands. I saw you had your hand up. Okay, I just like to get a show of hands so that we can. Okay, you got an aroused audience here, my friend. Okay, so let's take one from the front and then one from the back. Okay, you had your hand up with the glasses, right? In the back? Did I see? I saw the hand up. Yeah. Okay. So you're going to go first, and then you towards the middle back, and then the woman in the back there. Okay, and then someone will help me. Yeah. Okay, we got a lot of questions. So let's open it up. And by the way, Juana, who's on our staff, is going to be handing you the microphone. And you know what? Here at Revolution Books, we don't say, keep your comments to 30 seconds and only if it's a question and no comments. Bullshit. Say what you have to say and put it to David, okay?
Thank you, David. I just want to say I hope you laugh a little each day. Because, okay, I just want to make sure. I'm getting reverb. So I'm just curious, I'm going to get the book, but I hope that the ending is a little happier than the beginning.
It is, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, of the 20-something Democratic candidates, do you have a short list of favorites that you really think will do what they need to do?
Well, I think the only person that is really committed to climate in the way that we really need our politics to be committed to climate is Jay Inslee. But like, I have a hard time in a certain way practicing what I preach, which is that we need to elect representatives who make climate the only priority. And yet I find myself much more excited by Elizabeth Warren than I do by Jay Inslee. So in an ideal world, maybe I would have like a ticket of Warren with Inslee as a VP. But I would say that Warren hasn't yet released a climate plan. Neither has Bernie. They would probably be the two people likeliest to be closest to Inslee in their ambition. But really down the whole field, just about everyone except for maybe Delaney, who has released a climate plan or talked even in broad strokes about what they would want to do, is talking much more ambitiously than any Democrat has ever talked before in the entire history of the party on this, which is incredible. I think it's likely that this sort of arms race produces a consensus commitment to climate as a top priority, if not the top priority for the, I hope is the Democratic president in 2021, and that on some level it may not matter so long as we don't have like Biden or Delaney. It may not matter which of the candidates is the nominee, because they're all likely to be quite ambitious. And the limit on their ambition is almost certainly not going to be what they put in their policy papers, but whether they win the Senate and who, what Joe Manchin is going to tolerate, basically. So I'm impressed, honestly, with the Democratic field.
Okay, so you had your, yeah.
Thanks. Wait, let me just say one more thing. I'm not impressed with the way that the media has handled this in the campaign, because even though so many of the candidates have been so outspoken about climate change on the trail, we've heard, I think in the first two debates, we heard one question each night about climate, very curt, very short, and I just think that's hopelessly inadequate. They were also questions that were much more pointedly about the cost of action on climate change than about the necessity of moving forward. And I think we need a whole new approach when it comes to pressing candidates on their climate plans.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paul from, I live in the Lower East Side, and I work with WBAI Radio, but I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here because I'm very concerned about the subject. I live, some of us might remember Operation, Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, and talking about normalization. I mean, we normalized 40% of Manhattan being in the dark for 7 days. I mean, when did that ever happen? I lived here my entire life, and I never heard of such a thing. We had 1 day, day and a half was considered mega, and it went for 7 days, and people made jokes about it on TV and acted like it didn't happen, and that the ocean basically came in like a mile, and you have to realize it's a 200,000 people, of which 90,000 are in NYCHA housing, and it's still a poor neighborhood. And the city came up, both progressive people and not so progressive people faced with this reality came up with a plan. It was called the Big U, and it was a contest. You might have heard of it. It was actually a design contest put together by HUD, in which people, and I'm going to just take a minute to describe this, where people for over a 4-year period came in. It was funded by the Obama administration, and it took people's input, and there was many public meetings, and it was a tremendous thing. It was really an amazing thing where they came up with basically a plan to save Lower Manhattan based on, and Brooklyn and many areas, hundreds of thousands of people affected, to save them by coming up with a people's-oriented attempt to prevent climate change and sea level rise from destroying their neighborhoods, and used some of those modern, up-to-date things I'm sure you talk about in your book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, to do that, using parks as wetlands and recreating wetlands and using berms and interlocking systems. It was fascinating. And they took 4 years doing that, and then our very progressive city of New York all of a sudden stopped coming to meetings. And nobody knew what was going on, and they had no notice from the city what was going on, and nobody heard anything for like weeks and months, turned into months. And then in an October surprise, last October, the city stepped forward and said, forget it, we're not going to do this. And what they replaced the plan with, and they said, basically, you approve it now, you get nothing. And then they said, anybody who's against this plan is anti-NYCHA or just a privileged white racist who doesn't care about people in NYCHA who are going to be flooded out. And of course, it's always white people in the government saying that. And that we're going to raise the park, 57-acre park, we're going to actually raise it 10 feet off the ground, which not only it's a mega project, and I'll add, this is nothing, it's just the beginning, right? Not only just a huge mega project, but has no chance of working, and by the time, the projections for it would be already overlapped by the time it was constructed. So it was basically constructed for now, and by 2050, it would already be overlapping this huge project. And the thing that was behind it all is that they'll do anything to save the FDR Drive and to save all the cars from coming into New York City. And they didn't want to block traffic, but we don't really know why. All of a sudden, they threw out this community plan that people worked on for 4 years and replaced it with your typical mega construction project. Would destroy a park, reduce people's access to the waterfront, totally destroy the neighborhood, and many people think it's just an excuse to build, huge 70-story buildings and what have you. Well, that's just the beginning of it. Then people are saying, oh, we don't even have to do that. What's the new plan? We're going to spend, I'm not kidding, and construction is about to start. We're going to spend $60 billion minimum, and we're going to build a gigantic dam across the Atlantic Ocean, 5 miles, and then block off all the rivers, block off Long Island Sound. It'll be the largest dam ever built in human history by the Army Corps of Engineers. and it will entirely turn the estuary of the Hudson River, which people have worked around for decades through the Riverkeeper and the boat that goes up and down the Hudson and Pete Seeger and all that, to save and to bring back to life. It will literally turn us into a gigantic toilet that we will live in forever. And the whole purpose of it is to say, the city says it straight out, there is no way we're going to put into any sort of, we're going to allow a threat to the most valuable real estate in the world. There is no way, because
Hey, Paul, we do.
yeah,
I'm going to have
I'm
to.
coming to an end to here.
Yeah. So
we're
just
gonna,
other
I
hands.
think people should know this.
Yeah,
Nobody
okay.
knows it. Does anybody
Yeah.
know that? They came up and actually said that the economy community says you have 2 weeks to comment on it. They told the groups that are their whole lives are based on this, of fighting this for decades, this kind of thing, found out about it 2 weeks before the end of the public comment period. Right? And they had to run to court to change it. So these are the same people who brought us the atomic bomb. So this is the most progressive city in the world on climate change, in America on climate change. This is what their plan is to do. And they're dead serious, because they said to me right to my face, we're not going to put at risk for your hippie plans $60 trillion or $3 trillion or whatever it is of real estate. Or the cars, or the people, we love cars, quote unquote. All right. That's what's going on right now in New York.
Okay. So, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to protect the city, but I'm personally less aghast at that kind of infrastructure project, because I do think over time, probably something of that scale will be necessary. And I wish that it was implemented and developed with more consideration for a variety of actors and interests than simply the real estate interest. But I have a hard time imagining a New York City 50 or 70 years from now that isn't protected by a seawall. And I think the sea level rise is going to be so significant that addressing the threat with marshland and new estuary development is just not going to be sufficient. And I hope that I'm wrong about that, I guess. But I do think that we need to be planning in some quite ambitious, even unprecedentedly ambitious ways to protect not just New York, but communities all around the world. And I write in the book a little bit about, it's one thing for New York to try to build an infrastructure project like this. How do you do it in Bangladesh? Who's going to, whose real estate interests are going to pay for that seawall in Bangladesh? And I write a little bit about the possibility that we get to a place where we're talking globally about climate reparations, and the nations who are responsible for the most burning may be obligated to pay some amount of, reparation to support the adaptations that are necessary in the parts of the world that are hit hardest. On the other hand, the commitments that have been previously made by the first world to those in the global south on climate mitigation and adaptation have gone totally unpaid. So I think it's quite likely that we don't channel resources in those directions, even though those people are considerably more in need than those of us who live in a place like New York. I spoke a couple months ago with a climate scientist who does a lot of consulting on climate adaptation with the city, and asked him about the possibility of a seawall. And he said, yeah, no, of course we'll build a seawall, for exactly the reason you mentioned. The real estate's just too valuable. But he said, a project from start to finish like this takes 30 years, and maybe you could do it in 25. And even if we do that now, even if we start today, it'll be too late to save Howard Beach and other parts of South Brooklyn and Queens. And he said the city knows this, and you'll start to see it in the way that they respond to those communities. You'll start to see them choosing to not repair infrastructure in those neighborhoods, choosing not to do work on the subways. And soon enough, they'll be telling the people who own homes there, you may be able to live in this house until you die, but you're not going to be able to leave it to your kids. And yeah, that's, as you say, it's a progressive, incredibly wealthy city, and we're still probably not going to be able to save some portion of our population. I mean, those people will survive, but the neighborhoods won't.
Okay, the woman, there was, I was calling on three people. Yeah. There was a woman, right? Yeah.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. I'm Rachel. I had a different question in my head, and now I feel kind of perplexed at where to go with this. I think that this whole concept of new normal is confusing, and I feel like the we that we're so comfortable talking about can be so narrow and not like, taking, like for me, when I think of we, I'm thinking of humanity and not just New York City, but it's so difficult to get past that. I have family in New Orleans, and they
Wait,
were
why do
just-
you want to go past it? Don't you want to think of humanity as the we?
I do. I want humanity to be at the forefront of everyone's mind. What I'm saying is I don't know how to get our society, how to get people, how to get us to think beyond, locally, to think beyond like the immediate. In New Orleans, I have family there. They now have these community plans where they have copies of each other's keys so they can move the cars when the rains come in case somebody's out of town. And that's like the new normal. And, they lose their car got flooded in the last rains, and they now have to get another car, and they gave up a certain X, Y, and Z because their insurance is higher and everybody just accepts because it's so difficult to go up against it. It's how do you go up against anything? I was trying to leave work on time early today. I was like, I have to get, and I got into an argument with my boss about wanting to come to this program. And he is a doctor, and his whole thing is like, you can save your hobbies for later. And it's so stifling. How do you fucking go up? How do you break through that new normal mentality? It's exhausting.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely, we're struggling against it, all of us, and we're going to be dealing with the consequences of that struggle. I think the New Orleans example is really powerful. They just finished some new levees they built starting in 2014 in the aftermath of Katrina. They spent tens of billions of dollars on them, and they're going to be out of date by 2022 because of sea level rise. My feeling is about the big question is 70% of Americans are concerned about climate change now. Some similar number in most of the countries of the West. Those numbers are up like 10% over the last year. They're up, everywhere you look. The number of people who are alarmed is up dramatically. The number of people who are engaged on this issue is up dramatically. In the US, across the US, we have Democratic voters citing climate change as, depending on the poll, in some cases, the top political concern of the entire voting party. In other cases, at least a top shelf concern, like tied with healthcare. The world is really waking up to this threat, and I don't think we've yet evolved a politics to respond to it adequately, but the awakening is happening in part because of the extreme weather that we're seeing, which makes it unavoidable. And I think that it will continue to teach us that, it isn't a new normal, it's an end of normal. But we have to fight to make that clear. We need to fight to keep that momentum moving, and we need to fight to keep people engaged and agitated. I don't think there's like a simple rhetorical trick you can play to like make people see the world differently. But the most useful thing for those of us who are concerned about this is that the science is on our side, the weather is on our side, the news is on our side, and people are on our side. I mean, there's been so much talk in the aftermath of the Green New Deal that this was, it was too ambitious to try to join an agenda of climate justice to an agenda of climate action. And, this comes from an old way of thinking about climate politics. It is the way that the establishment of American politics sees it. It is the way that the establishment systems in much of the West see this problem. And yet, the Green New Deal is like insanely popular. It's got support of something like 68% of the American public. It's got majority support in the overwhelming majority of Republican states. And the parts of that program that are most popular are the social justice parts. It's not, the decarbonization that everybody's excited about. It's like the job guarantee and the fact that we're going to, if it's put into place, that we're going to be taking this action with a mind towards social justice, which is important from a moral perspective because climate change is something that hits those most in need most intensely, but it's also just politically really useful because the more ambitiously you describe the social justice ambition of a climate program, the more the public, almost anywhere you ask, is excited about it. And I think we have a distorted idea of where the center is on this issue because of what our two parties say and because of the recent past. But if you look at the polling, if you look at that data about public opinion, the center is like really pretty far left on climate change. And even if like you placed our policy in line with the median Republican voter, it would be to the left of anything that's ever been proposed by any Democrat in office in America. So I think like we need to be aware of, open to, and motivated by that fact, the fact that the public is behind this issue in a big way. It's just a matter of making those voices heard and pulling those levers in our politics where we can.
Okay, the person with the mic wants to pose a question or say something.
Hi. So first, thank you for your presentation. There were a lot of things that I did not know. The 4 degrees Celsius, future for me was unthinkable because when I was in school, it was 2 degrees and then it was already horrifying. So thank you for doing the work that you did. I want Raymond to read again that thing that he said about the half situation thing, please.
Page 214, you can't halfway your way to a solution to a crisis this big.
Halfway your way. I think that the solution, we do this in Revolution books all the time, right? But I think that the solution that you're hoping for is a halfway solution. And I am going to say this because, what you were saying about the global cooperative framework that is needed, I am going to say this with a big degree of certitude, is impossible under this competitive capitalism world. And it's impossible. You think about how every imperialist country, the ones that are the most polluters, they are terrified and horrified by the fact that China is a rising power, right? That China is a rising power. They are not going to cooperate. There is, if you think about what he just said, right, about the $1 trillion investment that was what was at the head and at the top of the interest of the people who are looking over and managing, the organization of the city, right? There was something that you said on regards of the political economy, or that you thought that was, more of encompassing than just looking at the economy. But under slavery, which was the economic system by which people, have their economy and their means for life were produced, the policies and the political system that existed under slavery was a political system that reinforced that economic system, right? So you have slave catchers that they were known to have to go and then catch the slaves that flee because that would have an effect on the system, the economic system that they were imposing, right? So the policies they come together, the political system is meant to serve that way that the society is organized. So the policies that we're seeing right now, even internationally, when governments keep doing these big commitments with climate change, or those policies are not going to, whatever they are saying is not going to be up on front of or like on top of what the economic system needs. And that is just, like something that I think that is very crucial for everyone in this room to come to see and understand. And I'm not a political economist as Raymond Lara is, but you can go and check on more like deep, like in depth of, like how societies came to be, how they are organized, how the economy actually influence the political system, the cultural system, like all these things, right? So I'm just saying that because I am growing more and more like uneasy as the conversation goes in the room, because if this is, if the thing that you just show, is the future that is awaiting for us, then this global cooperative solution is not going to happen. And then we need to like shake up, like kind of go to work at, okay, so how we're going to make that happen. And anyway, so that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we really disagree all that much. I think that the system that we have today can't support a solution to this problem. We need to really dramatically transform it. What degree it's transformed or upended, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm probably a little bit to the center of where you are, but I don't think that anything like the model that we have today is sustainable or defensible. I also think that already today, economists would tell you that the world will be much better off economically if we decarbonize rapidly. So, it's true that the fossil fuel business would not benefit if we did that. It's true that the cement manufacturers, cement is, if it were a country, it would be the world's third biggest emitter, would not benefit, and the airlines would not benefit. There are a lot of parties that would not benefit from rapid decarbonization. But it's also the case that, speaking globally, even quite, conservative economists would agree that this so imperils the possibilities of economic growth that we'd be better off decarbonizing. Now, I, like you, don't see that as a very plausible near-term path forward given the system that we have. But however we change the system, we sort of need to change it, for sure. When I talk about what a global cooperative network or framework would be, I don't know what that looks like. I don't think certainly it doesn't have to be, like the post-Cold War America-led system. I think there is a version of that system that could be revived and could help in this way, but there are many, many other systems as well. And I think we're only beginning to see the glimmers of what a world, the politics in a world that are really shaped by climate change will be. And I don't yet know what that amounts to. I think, I write in the book, I think it's certainly the case that certain nations of the world may end up imposing sanctions on one another for bad climate behavior. I think it's also possible that there are wars fought over bad climate behavior. Some perhaps as cover, as like an alibi for imperialistic behavior, but still in the name of climate. I think the options, the possibilities are quite wide open. And I think whatever happens, the world will be transformed, our politics will be transformed. I don't happen to feel confident that I know in exactly which way, but the transformation of the planet itself is so dramatic that there's no way that our political systems, our economic systems will be untouched by it. And that's really sort of the main theme of the second half of my book, which is, this humanities questions, getting outside of the science and thinking about what life will be like, and what solutions, what adaptations are possible.
Let me see how many other people would like to ask questions, make comments. What time is it?
It's 8:45.
8:45. Okay, maybe, hey, thanks for coming. Okay. So maybe what we could do is, I could ask people rather, and you could hopefully cooperate and collaborate, try to, make some very short, crisp comment or question so that we can give everyone, let me see the hands, because I'm actually going to, so it's you, okay, so 1, I'm going to go back. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then what was I said?
There's one person here.
There's four. Okay. Well, why not you and then we'll see if we have time for the videographer. Okay. So everybody gets it, but please, try to make it 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. And because it's great to have David here as a resource and presenting his book, and we're having our little dialogue and debate as well, which is what happens here at Revolution Books. And so let's go. Okay, so you were first, and then I see the hands. No, I was going front to back. Okay.
Thank you very much for this writing about this subject. I have so many thoughts going on in my head, so bear with me while I just try to get my thoughts together, because I've been extremely passionate about health all of my life. I think we really need to talk. I feel like we're living in a raging health crisis, because, of course, the climate and nature and our health physically, mentally, spiritually are intrinsically linked. And I was naive enough to think decades ago, that if people were just, took care of their own personal health, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that we would just be inevitably taking care of the planet as well. That didn't go over very well. As clearly, it was clear to me early in my life, decades ago, that the monetary system was going in one direction and health was going in another. And naively, I made it my mission in life that I was always going to put health first. And that was not, that seemed like a normal thing to do to me. But again, it wasn't for most people around me. And so I just don't understand, how we can live in a society where it does not revolve, and health and the environment is not the priority, and the man-made system is not in alignment with nature and health. It just doesn't make one bit of sense to me. I know, sorry.
Okay.
It's
okay, yeah.
I think one short answer is just an answer of rhetorical strategy is I actually do think that the public health issues related to climate change have been woefully underexplored and underutilized. I think they are a very clear way of communicating some of the immediate universal threat that climate change poses. And I think that activists and advocates could do much better to lean into that messaging and really talk about climate change as a public health crisis, because I actually do think we live in a culture where people are concerned about their health and well-being.
Could I just say,
Yeah.
I believe that climate destruction and child abuse and the breakdown of the family system are all interconnected. Because that's what I studied, the abusive family, child abuse, and the climate in the home of it, child abuse and divorce and all of that stuff, became normal. It became normal.
Okay, we're going to have to, but here, we're really rushing.
No.
I just want to let everybody speak, okay?
So,
Okay.
But I think the cognitive effects of air pollution, the effect on developing children
Right,
in utero,
right.
The health of children as they develop, their relationship between temperature and development, all of these are really powerful messaging tools that the climate movement has and has not yet really used. I think in part because people are receptive to messages of health and well-being, at least in a kind of contemporary American setting, and we could really get a lot more mileage out of that than we have.
Okay, you are going to, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, William, for this wonderful presentation. I must confess that
Maybe you could stand up because you seem to be.
I must confess that if
Yeah.
we have many people like Williams, ultimately we'll have another Steve Jobs to solve this climate problem in the world. However, I have a question for you. At the moment, the problem is so serious that, as you said, we either solve the problem or we leave it as it is and face the consequences. What do you think is going to be the consequence if it is not solved? because clearly I have observed that the present imperialist system in the world is not going to solve this problem. Deforestation is a major contribution to this global warming. And if poverty in Africa, for instance, remains as it is, where the forest cover is mainly concentrated in, I've even checked one literature from the United Nations, which says that only 30% of the land mass is covered by forests at the moment. And naturally, we all know that vegetation cover is what sets up the equilibrium of carbon emission. Well, it's one of the contributions of setting up the equilibrium. Now, as we are speaking now, we have people in the poor areas of the world that are going out, cutting down these trees, literally, for nothing but to cook every day. If you go and speak to them and tell them, look, you are making this world warm, they'll tell you, before you were born, I've been doing this. How will you make me eat? Now, what political system do you have in place to really stop those people out there in the villages to stop cutting down the trees? And according to one UN report, if the trend continues like this, in 100 years to come, there'll be no forest cover. And if that happens, guess what is going to? We're going to be talking about trees like dinosaurs. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things you raised that are really important. The way that historically, over the last decade or two, there was this sort of dilemma facing people in the developing world, where it was understood that either they could sort of grow relatively rapidly, or they could grow relatively responsibly, and it was felt globally, very and rightly, that there was a kind of something kind of morally grotesque about asking the world's poor to delay their growth and to put off some amount of material well-being for the sake of the health of the planet, when the world's wealthy had benefited for so long from the burning of fossil fuels. And I'm happy to say that that's no longer really the way that the economists of the world see this problem, in part because renewable energy has gotten so much cheaper, and in part because there's a much greater appreciation for all of the opportunities for growth that await sort of more green paths. So that trade-off or that trade that sort of like two alternatives path that used to be the way that the developing world saw this problem is no longer really reliable as a model. And I was particularly excited by a plan that the government of Indonesia put forward. This is a country that, they've doubled their per capita income in the last 20 years. They've halved their poverty rate. But like a lot of other nations in the developing world, they did that through industrialization. So they doubled their emissions at the same time. But they say that they can have their emissions by 2030, which would put them ahead of their commitments under Paris, and still grow at 6% per year, which is faster than they've grown over the last 2 decades when they've doubled their income. The plight of people in sub-Saharan Africa is especially dramatic in any serious climate change scenario. Already, economic impacts have been quite dramatic there, reducing many of those nations' GDP by as much as 25% already. And it's estimated that by the end of the century, many of those countries would have no hope of economic growth at all if climate change were to continue. That's how dramatic the climate impacts would be. And the impacts on agricultural yields are really horrifying. They're sometimes most intense in sub-Saharan Africa, just based on the kind of crops that are grown there and which are stable crops. So it's a crisis there as it is everywhere, maybe most intensely there, or as intensely as it is in India and the rest of South Asia. In terms of what the outcome is if we don't change course, I mean, I think it's that all of the things that I talked about at the beginning when I first got up and read from the book and talked a little. I mean, it's more war, more social disarray, more refugees, more sickness, more flooding, more extreme weather, more wildfires. You go down the list, anything that seems scary to you in the modern world, anything that's bad or broken in the modern world will be made worse by climate change. And thankfully, we also have the opportunity through climate action to at least mitigate some of those impacts and make some of the things that we want to see better in the world better through climate action. But there's almost nothing that will be untouched, which is to say undamaged. And so I think the consequences couldn't be more dramatic if we don't move. And like you, I have some doubt that we will move adequately. I have a lot of doubt that we will move adequately. But as I said earlier, I also don't think it's entirely accurate to think about this in binary terms and to think either we're going to solve the problem or we're not. I think the likeliest future is one in which there's quite a lot more suffering, that it's concentrated in the developing world and the global south, but that we make some progress and find ways to live to some degree amidst all that suffering. Hopefully, we can evolve a politics and a culture of empathy that forces more people to respond compassionately to the needs of those who are suffering more intensely. But again, that's not a matter of can we do that or can't we do it? It's a matter of degree. And to that, I think that's a lesson in every aspect of climate change. This is not a yes or no problem. It won't be solved or not solved. It won't be solved by a single silver bullet solution. If it is addressed, it will be addressed through many, many different responses, each of which tackle some small part of the problem. And I think it's the same for the question of human empathy, which is to say, like, I hope that we can cultivate that impulse, but if we're not able to respond as empathically as someone like you or I would like, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still keep fighting to try to attend to the needs of those who are most in need.
Okay.
There
was one more?
A young guy.
There was one, oh yeah, you in the back, right?
So
Okay, that'll be the last, okay?
Here and one.
Oh, you wanted to say something? Okay. Okay, so we're going to have two more. Oh.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I'm from Sunnyside in Queens. AOC is my congresswoman. The co-op where I live, they're putting solar panels on the roofs and covering our outdoor parking lot with solar panels. Just want to say, so we live during the time where we've seen the Earth as a whole from space. That's happened. That happened in my lifetime. That's the most consciousness-raising photograph ever taken. It's our nation's greatest gift to humanity, and that photograph can help us love the Earth, which I think we have to love the Earth as much as we love our family and dearest friends if we're going to face up to this emergency. Now I just read an astronaut, Mike Massimino's autobiography. He talks about his experience when he was repairing the Hubble telescope, and he's looking around at this unbelievable scene, and he felt that we live in heaven. I mean, that heaven's not someplace you go when you die. We live in heaven. So I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to face up to this. And in terms of a World War II-like mobilization, so I wasn't alive. I was born in '47, but I'm assuming the World War II mobilization was based on love of country, and the mobilization that we need now to save our civilization needs to be based on a love of planet. So I just wonder, what would a World War II type mobilization look like today if we were to embark on it?
Well, I'll answer that in a second. I would say, love of country was one thing that motivated it, but also people were just scared. They didn't want to live under a fascist regime, and they didn't want to have their way of life trammeled. And so, I mean, nations have complex motivations. I think they're not reducible to single messages, but I think World War II was fought as much out of desperate fear as it was out of hope and love. You know, if you just walk down the list of what happened in the U.S. in World War II, I mean, we saw the nationalization of most industries, the redirecting of most factories towards producing products that were useful in the war effort. You could do exactly that here today for climate in theory. There was a draft in which every man between the ages of 18 and 35 was called to national service, and practically speaking, many of the women were called into the workforce as a result, a kind of equivalent draft. All of them in the single pursuit of advancing the war effort. And, you know, that's what the Secretary General says is necessary to avoid catastrophic warming, and he says we need to start doing that this year. I think it's important to remember also that many people who lived through that experience of mobilizing through World War II felt it was and remembered it as the defining, ennobling experience of their lives. That it was a high point, even if they were on the battlefields suffering intensely, even if they were living separated from their families and loved ones, they still understood it as an incredibly empowering and invigorating experience to be called to action in that way. And I think we can hope for some version of that when it comes to climate. I think this is, you know, genuinely an existential story. I don't think that humanity is going to be wiped off the face of the earth over the next few decades if climate change continues unchecked. But we are defining who we are as people and who we are on this planet through what we do over the next few decades. And I hope that more people see that struggle in the same terms that you describe, seeing, you know, the pale blue dot photo as being a call to collective, universal human action and brotherhood and sisterhood in the face of this fight. I think not nearly enough people are doing that yet, but, you know, things are moving, as I said earlier, in the right direction. They're just moving way too slowly.
There is just one more question. Can we take it?
Was great. Okay, you had your hand up, so I want to really.
I just wanted to say thank you for giving this talk. I've been reading your book and I really enjoy it. I'm a grad student doing research on carbon negative energy, so it's like interesting to read about like climate change from the more existential questions you ask at the end of the book. I was just wondering if you've read Shoshana Zuboff's new book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, or know about it, and just like wanted to comment on it in relation to like the ongoing climate crisis. And
Well, I have read it. In what way are you thinking of the connection?
I don't know. I'm just I've like parts of your book you talk about like technology and like kind of how it separates us, and just like meanwhile like, you know, like sea levels are rising, but at the same time there's you know, like a huge exploitation of behavioral data through like smartphones and the internet and things like that. So I'm just curious, like, you know, what your perspective on it is, or like if you had an opinion on it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think our relationship to technology is really strange right now. I think that in theory, we're capable of generating enormous progress on climate change out of the tech sector. Very few people in Silicon Valley are interested in doing that. Very little money is being devoted towards real-world technologies of any kind. It's all like programming technologies, which won't help us much in this fight. And I think, as I write in the book, there's a real risk that we become so enamored with the world on our phones that we stop thinking of the real world outside of our phones as worth that much attention. And I think it's a strange and uncomfortable way that technology has become a kind of like a handmaiden to ecological destruction. And there's that concern. There's also the concern that like we have just like the conventional American believes that technological progress has been really rapid over the last generation, that everything has changed, and that therefore things can change again in a way that can help solve this crisis. And I think that that's really misleading and actually wrong about the recent history. So, you know, it took 40 years between the time that the internet was invented and the time that it reached something like global saturation. It took like something like 25 years for cell phone technology to really take over the planet. Even if you just think of the iPhone, it's been out for 10 years and it has something like 15% of the global market. So when we hear like tributes to the world-changing vision and technological ability of someone like Steve Jobs, who was mentioned earlier, I think we really underestimate the difficulty of scaling even technology that is so transformative. If the UN is right and we have only 10 years left to have our missions, we don't have time to invent new technologies and scale them. Literally, like the most viral technology that's been produced over the last generation, the iPhone, has barely penetrated globally from the perspective, if you take the scale that we need, like a green energy tech to scale, that iPhone model is hopelessly small. Even the internet took hopelessly long, way too long. And that to me means that we need to focus much less on technological breakthroughs and much more on political breakthroughs that can implement the technologies that we have today at dramatic scale. I am really actually worried about surveillance capitalism and surveillance generally. It's something I've thought about writing about myself. And I think that we're still collectively operating under a sort of outdated model that's pulled from Orwell that is really and essentially concerned about state surveillance. And we're starting to adjust the idea of corporate surveillance, but we haven't yet really processed the fact that it is not a single entity that is surveilling us anymore. Our data is being distributed globally through many different brokers selling them from one platform to another. And the concern is not that there's one entity watching us who might decide one way or the other about our fate, even in their platform. It's that our data is being used, appropriated, interpreted in many more ways than we can really appreciate, totally distributed fashion, and we don't at all have a intellectual or legal model to use in studying that. But I don't happen to think that that itself is so directly related to the climate crisis, except in as much as it's another story of corporate interests, taking advantage of the broader population. But it's, how surveillance evolves over the next few years and even decades is going to be a major story. I think it's not quite as major as climate, but right up there.
Okay, you're going to be...
Yes. In your talk, you mentioned some examples of what you saw as positive political developments around global warming. But in your book, in your chapter on potential political consequences, you also paint some dark futures. And in particular, you use the term eco-fascism. And I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in short, it's the idea that right-wing movements around the world could use the climate crisis as a justification for much harsher policies, most probably first against immigrants, refugees, but also to justify more authoritarian hold on the population, more repression of dissent, all that kind of stuff. And I think we're already seeing some of that. The European Union elections a few months ago were kind of a major victory for the Green Party, which they were sort of, to the extent there was a winner, like the Green Party advanced their cause much more than any other party. But there were also gains made on the opposite side of the spectrum, including by politicians who are using the climate crisis as an argument against open borders, basically. A spokesperson for Marine Le Pen said, borders are our best defense against the climate crisis. And if you were to imagine a politics that was going to evolve out of a sense that resources were diminishing in the world, you would imagine a politics that was built around zero-sum model rather than positive-sum understanding of politics. You would imagine nations retreating into nationalistic self-interest and retreating from the commitments they'd made previously to other nations and communities of nations. And you'd see even conversations about the climate crisis itself. You'd imagine conversations about the climate crisis itself would take place very narrowly in this band of like, how can we live in a world that is degraded? And how can we secure for ourselves in a brutal world some kind of future that we can live with? And I think we're already seeing in the US, in Brazil, in Russia, in China, we're seeing some flickers of that politics. I think it hasn't yet arrived in full, but I think it should really concern us that it's here already, and especially because some of these ecological realities, the logic of them does push you towards panic. I mean, I've had a lot of people over the last year come up to me and say to me, where should I move? And, you know, that's answering a universal problem with a request for self-interested information. And not to say I understand that impulse. I mean, you look at the world, you think it's going to be horrific, you want to secure a life for your loved ones in it. That's a totally human, understandable impulse. But we also need to define the person who's staring down sea level rise in Bangladesh or dealing with extreme heat in Calcutta as though they're part of our family too. And we want to secure a life for them as well.
That's right. And I think we're going to, on that note, we're going to end the discussion and the program tonight. I do want to say that we have some resources here at Revolution Books. Look around, you see all the books, and in particular, in connection with the book that was presented and the back and forth that we've had in some of the controversy, I do want to call to people's attention the principles of socialist sustainable development. Okay, the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, those speak to how a liberatory socialist society would actually tackle this environmental emergency. And it requires the total transformative restructuring of the economy, the reconfiguring of how we live, how we produce goods, how we interrelate with the world and with nature. And as he emphasizes in the book, that the idea of a strict separation between nature and society, human beings and nature, this is a fallacy, that we're all imbricated in this. And the principles of socialist sustainable development bring to life and show how a socialist society would go to work on this, no longer fettered by capitalist principles and imperatives of profit and more profit, privatization, the commodification of nature, what it would mean for humanity to actually confront this crisis on the scale and with the urgency and mobilizing resources, technology, but what's the most important means and mechanism for confronting this, and that's human beings, people, mobilizing the creativity, the energy, all of which is suppressed within this society. Whether we're talking about the scientists and the engineers who have all kinds of ideas and who have got the analysis, but that goes nowhere fundamentally. And the principles of socialist sustainable development and the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, I would strongly commend that to people's attention. And let's come back and have a discussion about why you cannot resolve this within the system of capitalism, or why you think you can, and we'll take it further, right? And you had posed the question about we have to rethink our relationship to capitalism, right? And here I would suggest that we have to rethink what the problem is, and it is capitalism, and that's the debate that we get into, and we have to go further. And you've really added so much to our understanding of the scope of this crisis and the interconnectedness of its different dimensions, right? And we cannot fall into the fatalism or look for easy, deceptive solutions that are no solutions. We really have to confront it for what it is. So the other article that we have here, I wrote a piece that's called 5 Reasons the Green New Deal is Misleading, Dangerous, and Part of the Problem. And I would also commend that to your attention, but I'm not going to hold forth on that now because we've had a very good airing of these issues. And please stay behind. We've gone longer than we normally do, but that's thanks to your presentation, okay, David? And please buy the book. He'll sign it. And I want to thank everyone for coming out. And yes, proceed from the interest of humanity and the planet itself.